Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.6 Imaginarium Theater guide. The biggest change to this theater is that we're now being rewarded for getting stars. Getting 3 stars gives you some artifact XP, 60 gives you resin, and 9 gives you an elixir towards crafting a custom artifact. This is a pretty rare resource, so it's worth grabbing if you can. The elements that we have available to us this season is Cryo, Dendro, and Electro. I won't go through the resonances as much this time because they're less relevant when you get a lot of buffs and blessings from the theater itself. The only one I want to mention is Electro Resonance. When you run 2 Electro characters in a team, when you trigger an Electro reaction, you get extra energy particles. This can be useful in theater because you often run odd builds where your characters might not have the energy they need, but this is also a little rarer in theater because in a lot of the acts you go through, you're facing quite a few enemies at the same time anyway, and so you get more energy via that. As far as reactions go, we have Quicken, which is a combination of Electro and Dendro. When you combine them, you create an aura on an enemy, and then when that's hit further with either of those elements, damage instances happen. So when you apply Dendro to a Quicken aura, you'll get spreads for extra damage, and vice versa, aggravates for Electro. The only other reaction we have is Superconduct, which is a combination of Electro and Cryo. That will create an instance of damage and lower enemies' physical resistance by 40% for 12 seconds. It's also a little bit annoying because this takes the priority over the Quicken reaction. If you have Dendro and Cryo on an enemy and you apply Electro to them, Superconduct will always happen before Quicken will. Meaning if you're playing a character like Alhaitham or Sino, you're going to trigger Superconducts if you have off-field Cryo characters instead of triggering spreads or aggravate, so you get less damage from that. This though isn't quite as relevant this theater because you don't care so much about your character's damage because the buff effects are so significant. So let's talk about the buffs, otherwise known as Brilliant Blessings. I didn't talk about this last theater because the results you got from it were less relevant, but this theater it makes a big difference. That's because we don't have a reaction at all between Dendro and Cryo. If you put them both on an enemy, they can coexist, but they don't do anything together. But in theater, they didn't want that to be on its own, so they've added a blessing, a Brilliant Blessing, when you have both of those elements on an enemy. This is called Rhymegrass Origin. So when you apply Dendro to an enemy, they'll get a debuff. When you apply Cryo to an enemy, they'll also get a debuff. When both of them are present on an enemy, they'll combine and create thorns underneath an enemy, doing constant Cryo and Dendro damage. And this is quite a lot of damage. But this gets further enhanced significantly if you pick the next blessing, Rhymegrass Inceptive Electrovine. Changes the Sado reaction from needing Cryo and Dendro to now needing Cryo, Dendro, and Electro on top of it, but gives you a lot more damage. This increases the damage it does by 1.5 times and the frequency of the occurrence of the damage, converting it from Cryo and Dendro to purely Electro. Tried to calculate instance damage of these Brilliant Blessings in previous theaters and found out that they were all pretty similar really, but this Electrovine is significantly higher. Getting this Brilliant Blessing can really carry you through no matter what characters you're using. The condition here is that you need to then balance your teams around being able to bring a Cryo, a Dendro, and an Electro character to almost every chamber, because if you don't have that combination of characters, you're not getting the most out of this blessing. Talking about characters, I want to say that characters are, again, because of this buff and the amount of damage that the blessings do, characters themselves are less significant. In previous theaters, I would complain about characters like Escoffier, because Escoffier is a character that requires a team of only Hydro and Cryo to be able to get the most out of her buffs, getting 55% resistant shred with only Hydro and Cryo characters, but as soon as you add in a different element, that drops all the way down to 15%, losing 40% resistant shred. That's a huge amount, and that's a big difference to what Escoffier does. But because of the amount of damage you're getting from the blessing, that makes what she does less significant, so she's still useful because she still does damage and good off-field Cryo application that helps you proc this blessing more often. The same goes for a character like Kanich, who realistically would want Burning or Burgeons in your team to be able to make the most out of him, but just by applying on-field Dendro and having reasonable amounts of damage in spite of that, he's still really useful in these teams. And this is really what I wanted out of theater, bringing strange teams together that usually wouldn't work but are fun to play because of all the strange buffs you get. And so even though they don't function the same way, you still get a lot of damage because of all the blessings. Okay, so now you've got a good idea of how this particular theater is going to work, let's go over some general tips. So of course throughout theater you want to be thinking about using certain characters up and saving certain characters for certain enemies. Some acts will have characters that are really weak to maybe Electro damage, whereas some really weak to Cryo damage, so you want to make sure you have characters prepared for those particular stages. Maybe even planning the teams that go around them, but we can talk more about that when we look at the acts individually. You want to make make sure you're taking a good balance of damage dealers and support characters. If you take all damage dealers, you're going to be stuck with a bunch of on-fielders, and only one of them is going to be able to do stuff at a time. So make sure you're taking sufficient off-fielders so that you can make reasonable teams where you have enough off-field application of elements. Because of the weird teams you're going to be making, characters won't be able to get the energy they normally do because they'll probably be running different supports. Therefore, taking a lot of energy and favonius weapons on supports is a sensible thing to do because it'll ensure that those teams will still work even with weird orientations. Mystery caches, as usual, mystery caches are very useful to take and can be completely run changing. Mystery caches can give you those flowers that are the currency to get you more blessings, more characters, or even help you get characters back that you previously used, which are some of your strongest characters. I also want to touch on here how the blessing levels themselves work. When you pick your difficulty, you start off with a number of characters you're required to take. Every excess character you take over that limit gives you a free 2 blessing level, and as you're going through the theater, picking those brilliant blessings, those buffs, also increase your blessing level by 1. Those blessing levels then increase all of your character stats, their HP, their attack, their defense, their elemental mastery by a significant amount. And for the special guest characters, because they can't interact with the blessing reactions, they get double the amount of blessing level buffs. So for example, if you end up with 10 blessing levels, that's 500 attack and 200 elemental mastery on every character. Lastly, as always, you should borrow a character if you can. You can borrow them from friends or strangers that you just see having cool characters in the co-op menu. Getting a character that's much better than the one that you own, or simply you don't own them and they're a high constellation, can help carry you through certain stages. Someone last time asked for some recommendations on characters to borrow. Last time it was a bit more obvious because Navia was really good against the last 2 bosses, but the last 2 bosses in this theater are quite different in their requirements. So my first recommendation would be Wriothesley. Wriothesley is quite an independent character. They don't have too many requirements on their team to do well. Unlike most other cryo DPS, they can use the Marachose set to get the most out of their DPS without relying on Farina. And the last boss that you fight in the whole of the theater on Act 10 really wants you to bring a lot of cryo hits, so Wriothesley can fulfill this requirement on his own. The other character I'd recommend that really doesn't rely on their teammates and has a lot of raw damage is Veressa. Veressa, being one of the newer DPSs, just has a crazy amount of damage in her kit, so she's a great choice to borrow. She's also one of the only characters that does very well against the Weasel enemy in Act 7, and she's also one of the fewer characters that can make really good use of Ian-san. Okay, something I'm not going to do, but I could do for future theaters if people really want this, is going over all of the roles of the different characters and how you'd play them if you took them, or simply like a tier list on the priority of which characters to build that you might not have leveled. Say you need one more cryo character and you don't have Rosaria and Layla leveled, which would be better for a general account. In the meantime, if you have those kind of specific questions, feel free to drop them in my Discord or Twitch. And if you have build questions, I highly recommend going to either KQM or a great website called Crimson Witch, which I actually helped decide a lot of the build stuff for. Okay, after all of that preamble, let's get into the actual acts. For Act 1, if you open up and you have a lot of currency to buy some blessings, it might be worth starting until you get access to the Rhinegrass blessing. And also remember, for Act 1 and 2, they're a lot easier, the enemies are low level, so it might be worth trying to get rid of your weaker characters then and saving your stronger characters for later. My personal favorite enemies to fight in Act 1 are the Rune Drakes and the Rune Graders because they're simple and there's few of them. I would personally just choose to avoid the Wild because it has that odd energy draining mechanic, but that's it really. Oh, and remember, any of the Rune machines, not the Fontaine mechs, the Rune machines always have high physical resistance. That's apparent this theater because physical characters aren't that bad because we have a superconduct blessing, and to the same point, humanoid characters always have lower physical resistance. For Act 2, the Breaches have higher dendro resistance, so even though they're easy to fight, I avoid them unless I have a Fontaine unit to break their wards, and so I'll generally choose the Fontaine mechs. In Act 3, you're facing the Jadeplume Terrorshroom. We last faced them in the second half of 5.4, so if you want a really in-detail guide on them, you can go check that guide. So I'll cover the basics here. So they have really high dendro resistance starting out, so don't bring a dendro character as your main damage dealer, but you'll want to bring a dendro and an electro character because applying electro and dendro to them charges up their rage bar really fast. Once that rage bar is full, they will do a special rage attack and then collapse, being exhausted and being weakened and having much lower resistances for a period. So make sure to make the most of this time when they're weakened to get out your big damage. I also wouldn't bring Pirate. If you picked up Dale or Zhangling as a special guest star character, don't bring them here because applying Pirate essentially reduces all the effort you'd put to getting the rage bar up, so it will never end up in that weakened state. On Act 4, of course, we're onto the Monolith chamber. As usual, to distract enemies, you can crowd control them, but we don't really have much access to that this theater. You can just do enough damage to them, but the only taunt we have is, I think, an Auroron? And he won't have 100% uptime on his burst. So again, I really like to fight the secret source automatons because it's very easy because you're only fighting one of them to distract them for the majority of the fight, and then you just whittle down the time. You don't even have to do damage to them if you're distracting them for long enough. But the same thing goes, for example, maybe you're fighting the Saurians. You can quite easily get the attention of two of them at once, and as long as you're hitting them and hopefully gather them next to each other, it's pretty easy to keep their attention. In Act 5, one of the enemy choices are Hydro Mimics, and I really like fighting Hydra-infused enemies this theater. It's because you can still apply Dendro to them, you can still apply Cryo to them, so you can get all of those Rhyme Grass Blessing buffs. But on top of that, you're getting blooms, and so those Electro characters create a lot of Hyper Blooms. I would only choose to fight the Rift House if I had Electro as my main source of damage, and I would always choose to avoid the Mimesis if I can, again just like the Wilds, because they're an annoying mechanic to deal with. It's more conditional, so I can't run whichever teammates I end up bringing in there. In Act 6, we're fighting a very strange enemy. We're fighting a local legend from the Sea of Bygone Days, from the Arlecchino area. This is Cineas. Cineas is a little bit like a Wyob. Soon into the fight, they will create an area around them. This area doesn't increase your damage, but it does continually drain your energy. It's not as fast as the Wyob where it instantly wipes it out, but it will continue to decrease it, and once you run out of energy to drain, it will then start draining your HP and doing a lot of damage. During this time, it will also create a ward on itself, a Hydro ward, and it's worth 16 units, meaning you need 8 applications of Dendro or 16 applications of Cryo. While it's got this ward, it's not completely immune to damage, but it does have a lot higher resistances. And so because you're not actually gaining anything from being in the area, you can just stand outside it and apply Dendro from a distance, because Dendro is going to be the most effective way of breaking this ward by a long way. A good amount of Dendro or Cryo will be a great way of dealing with this ward. Because of this, I would advise saving one charge on Nahida at least to fight Cineas here. Nahida applies a lot of Dendro, so she's able to break its ward really fast. I also wanted to point out how awful Mawika is against this thing. Because Mawika has no energy, she instantly starts taking the huge HP drain from it. So if they ever decide they want to do an anti-Mawika Abyss, you'll probably see this guy in it. Okay, on to Act 7. In Act 7, we have another enemy that you might not have fought ever before as an option, which is the Weasel from the new area. This Weasel, at a certain point throughout the fight, will create a white ward on itself, and that ward takes much more damage from plunge damage. Because we only really have Veressa as our one plunge option here, if you take Veressa, you can run this and beat it quite easily. But if you don't have Veressa, I wouldn't choose to fight this enemy. On the other hand, Veressa doesn't do as well against the Rune Drake and the Rune Hunters. They're my usual favorite enemy, but if you jump up against the Rune Hunter, they will ascend to try and be higher than wherever you got to, so they can make it really hard to hit them with damage. If you're running characters that shield, like Kirara or Sitlali, as they have anti-shield mechanics, buffing them up when they hit you while you're shielded. And of course, the Hydra Abyss Herald that dashes all over the place and the Wyob combined are two really annoying enemies, so I would definitely avoid them. Then we're on to Act 8. Act 8, we're facing ASIMON. ASIMON, just like the Terrorshroom, we also fought in 5.4 Part 2, so if you want to go check out that guide, but simply, at some point during the fight, pretty early on, he will turn himself invisible. During this time, he will then summon some objects on the ground. If you break one of them, he will then try and repair those objects, summon some new objects that have Dendro on them. If you have those new objects with the little green Dendro lines with Electro, it will instantly reveal him. On the other hand, if you apply Electro and Dendro to him while he's invisible, he will instantly appear. So it should be pretty easy to get him to appear, the only annoying part being trying to find him. You can mark him in a lot of ways to reveal him. You can apply an element to him, you can apply a mark like Nahida's or Lisa's, or you can debuff him. All of those things will put little markings on him while he's invisible and reveal him, making it easier to then go hit him with Dendro and Electro. He also has really high resistances while he's invisible and loses all of that when he exits invisibility. So make the most of this time while he's vulnerable. For Act 9, it's the one where you have to target one particular type of enemy and the rest of them don't count for anything. Here I really like the Hydra Eidolons and the Mimics the best because you get all those free reactions while still being able to proc all of your blessings. And the Rune Machines, even though they're the elite enemies, are actually pretty okay to fight. It's easy to identify which is your target because they're the much bigger enemy. And the Rune Machines machines themselves are quite large and clunky, so it takes them a while to get to you and they often don't get in your way. Again, the Rift Hounds only fight them if you're doing mainly electro damage because they get lower electro resistance when they're hit by electro damage. I would not recommend the Mimesis because of the Abyssal wards. The one I dislike the least by a good margin is the Abyss Mages, just because you have to 1, defeat a lot of them, and 2, they all have Hydro wards, and so you're not reliant on the amount of damage you do. It's not as generic to fight them. There's more conditions and it's just annoying to deal with, so yeah, I wouldn't recommend the Abyss Mages. Then lastly, we're fighting a brand new boss that's never been in any endgame mode called the Secret Source Automaton Overseer device, or I'll call it the Cryo Automaton. This is because very soon into the fight we'll enter a mode where it has a little bar next to its name, just like the Lava Dragon, just like the Terrorshroom. I will go into lots of detail when it eventually appears in Abyss, but to get past it you need to do a lot of cryo hits essentially. It starts off with 32 points and gains 5 every second. When it gets hits by cryo, it loses 4. That means you need to be hitting it more than once every second with cryo to make that bar go down. The reason you want it to go down is it has really high resistances in this mode, but once it gets below 10 points, those resistances drop significantly and it gets really low cryo resistance, -40, where it's 0 for all of the others. So ideally bringing a cryo damage dealer like Ganyu, Raizi, Ayaka is ideal here. But if you're using an off-fielder, then that can also work. Something nice this theater is that superconducts are also cryo hits of damage, and so proccing superconducts counts towards decreasing that bar. So even though someone like Sitlali is only doing 1 hit every 1 second, which isn't fast enough to make it go down to 0, with the superconducts that you're doing, that gets it low enough to drop it down to 0 points, and so you can do all of that damage when it has low resistances. If you don't have cryo, say you only have Dendro and Electro characters left, but that Electro character is Veresa, it also has a bar that's separate to do with Night Soul. If you get lots of characters spending lots of time in Night Soul for it, it also reduces its resistances. Instead of going down to 0, it's down to 50, but it's still a good margin. So it is another way to defeat this boss. And remember, if you've already got 9 stars, it doesn't matter how long it takes you to kill this boss. You don't need a star for this one to get all of the star reward. Hopefully that's all of the information you need to get past these chambers. If you have any other questions, of course you can ask them in the comments, or thoughts or things I've missed out on. That's always helpful, not just for me, but for anybody else watching this video. And if you enjoyed this and thought it was helpful, it's always appreciated if you share it around. Anyway, I wish you all the best, getting all the rewards, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye bye!